Hello everyone and welcome. We're here to talk about digital transformation and how that will impact your local authority. The best way to demonstrate this is to look at how things might be in your future state using SAP Concur. With that in mind, we'll give you an overview of the key functionality that resonates with local authorities to drive the digital transformation agenda. So let's look at how life will change for me as a user of the platform and as someone who wants to get reimbursed. The areas we'll be talking about are subsistence reimbursement and mileage reimbursement. So I first log into the SAP Concur application. That's available from the App Store for iOS devices and Google Play Store for Android. When I'm ready to capture some expenses, I simply open the application and start to add them. So let's start by talking through what we're seeing on the home screen here. I'm set up as a full user of Concur with the ability to request permission to travel, through to booking trips, then capturing expenses and submitting them for approval. As a manager, I can also approve expense reports from my team on my mobile device as well. Today we'll focus mostly on capturing and submitting expenses, focusing on how we can capture subsistence claims and how we can capture mileage. We'll start by looking at mileage. At the bottom of the screen, you can see we have the mileage icon. This gives me two options for capturing mileage. Number one, I can enter the mileage manually. That was what we call mileage via postcode, so we'll look at that first. Now, a few days ago, I went on a work assignment, so I launched the mileage calculator and put in my start location. Concur knows my home location as it's saved in my profile, so it appears in my most recently used locations, along with any other places I've visited recently. So I started at my home location and I went for a meeting at a client site in Maidenhead. After that, if for example I'm a social worker in a local authority, I might need to visit additional locations in that day. And we make it easy for the user to add additional locations. So let's say I went to the council offices in Southampton before I travelled home again. There you can see Concur has calculated that entire journey using Google Maps, a tool that everyone's familiar with. Then as an authority, if you require users to deduct their commute distance, that can also be enabled. You can see Concur already knows where I live and my work location from my Concur profile, and you can decide whether that needs to be a deduction for a one-way or a round trip. And we can enforce that deduction of that commute distance if required. You can also see that Concur knows my car details, and it also tracks against the 10,000 miles HMRC allows me to do at the full rate before that goes to the reduced rate. We can also support any kind of mileage rates required, whether you're using the standard HMRC rates or specific custom business rates that you have in place. So I make sure I have the right date, and when I'm happy with that expense, I can either save it to a claim that already exists, or I can save it to my expenses and add them to a claim later. And I'm going to save them for later. As you can see, there are a number of other expenses I've captured that are also available, some of which are mileage expenses that were captured using our second method of capturing mileage, which uses a solution called Concur Drive. Now, Concur Drive is a technology built into the Concur app that enables the capture of mileage automatically, and it's very accurate as it uses GPS technology. Concur Drive can be used a couple of different ways. The first is what we call user initiated, where the user chooses to start tracking mileage and it continues capturing the mileage until the user presses stop on the phone. The second method is what we call scheduled. And scheduled allows me to set the times and days that I want it to track my mileage. We can also use things like the Bluetooth connection and the sensors built into the modern smartphones to ascertain when the car starts and is in motion, so we know when to start tracking mileage. So the user can control when mileage should be tracked and recorded based on their working hours using this feature. Any recorded trips can automatically be added to the user's available expenses so that they can be added to an expense report. So that covers the core of mileage, and we can support both personal and company car mileage rate calculations. Now let's look at the other areas that most people require, and that's the capture of subsistence expenses. Now the scenario is I've been away for the day and my expense policy allows me to buy an expense breakfast if I've left my home before 7:30 a.m. Once I've bought my breakfast, rather than taking a paper receipt and holding onto it to scan or staple to a paper report, I can use Concur's expense it functionality to capture a picture of that receipt, which then reads it using the OCR, that's optical character recognition technology, and creates the expense automatically for me. So let's look at that now. I simply open Expense It within the app, which activates the camera on my phone. Concur then uses the OCR technology to read the receipt locally on the phone to determine the cost of that expense as it appears on the receipt. And you can see there that the cost of my breakfast on this receipt was £8.04, and Concur has correctly identified that. Then the receipt gets sent to Concur servers to do a full OCR reading of that receipt to convert the digital data into an expense entry that the user can submit. As you'll see, I get a push notification when it's completed, and if I simply refresh my expense list here, and we can now see that the image has been turned into an expense entry. So let's look at that. We can see that the system has coded that to breakfast, and that will be matched up to a GL code automatically. And all the other key data about this transaction, the supplier, the date, and the location, has been captured and turned this into a valid expense entry, which makes my life really easy. As an added benefit, if I'd used a corporate credit card, a company credit card that was issued to me by the local authority, Concur will automatically match this expense on the phone with the card transaction when it comes into Concur from the card provider. As you can see, I now have these expenses that I've captured over the course of my work, and I can move all of these onto an expense claim. So I simply select them all. And I can either move them to an existing claim, so it shows me any open claims that I have available, or I can easily create a new claim. So let's do that now. And as I create a claim, all the data that's needed for me to submit my claim is captured in my Concur profile, and it pre-populates into this expense header. So I don't need to key in any cost centres or department codes, it all happens automatically. If I needed to allocate this to a different cost centre, I can do that as long as I've been given the permission to do so. I can also change the claim name, and then all of the expenses I've captured are moved on to this claim that I'm just about to create. Once the expenses are moved on to the claim, any policy rules I might have broken are easy for me to identify so that I can go in and correct them. And you can see straight away that I have a number of things that need my attention. So I have a red flag on that breakfast expense that I just captured. So let's have a look at what that's telling me. And in this instance, it's related to capturing data that's relevant to VAT. And it's to enable the local authority to reclaim that VAT from HMRC. Now, in order for the authority to reclaim the VAT, they need to know whether this is what was hot or cold food, and that will then calculate what VAT has been charged. Now you can see as a user, I don't need to know what the VAT rules are. I simply need to tell Concur whether this was hot or cold food, and Concur then calculates what VAT is recoverable from this expense. And now I've completed that required information, you'll see that the red flag for that breakfast expense type disappears, and that expense can now be submitted. I also have some yellow warnings telling me that these expenses need my attention, and this is either reminding me about policy issues or other notifications or warnings that the authority wants to present to me based on the expense policy. So you can see with the train expense, if I go into that one, the company policy when we're booking train is to use my corporate credit card. I've paid for this out of my own pocket, and the platform is reminding me that the preferred method of payment for this expense type is company credit card. So it's guiding me to behave in the right way, so I know next time to use the corporate credit card if I'm taking the train. Next, if we look at the personal car mileage expense, this is the expense that we just created using the postcode to postcode with the number of stops. And because I've had to do a number of stops, obviously my journey was quite lengthy. Now the platform is telling me that because my journey was over 100 miles, the local authority's policy entitles me to hire a car. So again, this is information that's very helpful in allowing me to abide by the expenses policy that's in place. There is one final red warning on my public transport expense. And this is asking me for additional detail on the type of transport, and this is simply for reporting purposes. So in this case, it was a bus. So I'm going to update that, and my report should now be ready to go. You'll see that the red flag clears. I still have a couple of yellow flags as just notifications or things to be aware of. So with very little effort on my part, as someone that's incurring expenses, and I have a well-formed claim with all the required data that is ready to submit for processing. And this can go off to be audited and then approved by my manager. The whole process is quick and digital and makes expense reporting simple. And if I'm a manager, I can also use my mobile device to approve expenses on the go. That concludes our quick walkthrough of how Concur simplifies and digitises the process. Thanks.